Good evening, friend. I see you've wandered into another tavern, and I can't help but wonder, what do you hope to hear from the bards this evening?
Moriden, Athluan.
Tonight, dear listeners, I tell you the tale of Moriden Stormcrown, the Dragonborn of the 4th Era.
Using his mastery of magic, Moriden faced down the Mad Mage Ancano and prevented him from tapping power that would have ended the world.
Bah, master of magic indeed.
Through his cleverness, his strength of arms, and the power of his voice, he had captured the mighty Odahviing and forced it to reveal the location of dreaded Alduin.
Stepping through the veil, he entered the hallowed halls of Sovngarde itself and battled the World Eater, destroying the beast and saving all of Nirn for a second time.
Not that anyone noticed at the time. I sometimes wonder why I bothered.
Now, top off your ales and listen as I tell of his time among the mighty companions of Skyrim and his rise to power as their harbinger.
You have got to be kidding me. There is almost no chance that they know what happened among the companions, let alone all the time I spent gathering political power to myself. No, they have it all wrong. You, though, you seem almost desperate to hear the story. What is it you are looking for, I wonder? Well, since you want the story so bad and we seem to have time, why not order us a couple of drinks and I'll tell you the truth of that time. The truth, mind you. Not that drivel that bard up there is embarrassing themselves with. Because the truth... the truth is not what the bards would have you believe. "11 Morningstar, 4th Era, 201. I awoke rather earlier than I had intended, and puttered around for a few moments more in the museum, as though there was more for me to accomplish there. And then I went to the newly renovated porch around the guild house, where the Devaveza was docked and waiting for me. Speaking strictly of its appearance, it was a far sight sturdier and better looking than my previous airship. Despite that, it was still an airship, which meant it hovered in the air in exactly the same way that bricks don't. That made me nervous, and I hadn't even set foot on board. I forced myself to do so, however, and was forced to admit that the Khajiit refit of the ship did make it almost as appealing a home base as the safe house was. Almost. Even so, if I could just grit my teeth and bear it, this could move me across Skyrim even swifter than Arvak could. I made the decision to try it. After deliberation, I had decided last night that the Reach would be my first site of investigation for more power, both political and Daedric. So it was that, with my eyes mostly closed, I set forth on the voyage to the Reach. 4 bone-chilling hours later, I arrived in Markarth. It must have been a sight from the streets, seeing the ship sail in and dock itself above the Temple of Dibella. I wish I could have seen it from there. It would mean I wasn't on the ship, still shaking. I made for the throne of Jarl Igmund of Markarth, who started by apologizing for the entire wrongful imprisonment thing, and because he had decided it was all Madonach's fault, also pardoned me for escaping from the unescapable mine. I made little of it. That was a long time ago at this point, and I had no mind to make waves over it. Unless I had to, anyhow. Since purchasing a home in the city, the real mark of power in a hold, was my real aim, I made no qualms about announcing my desire. He all but laughed at me, which I found interesting in ways that should have made his blood go cold. Instead, he basically called me a nobody, which, honestly, how could he possibly believe given my actions these last months? And said there was about no chance that would happen. Unless, of course, I did him and his people a few favors. I sighed. I knew this dance. I accepted his request to deal with a few Forsworn leaders and then left to wander the city somewhat, see if I could detect the presence of any of the remaining Daedric lords. I first decided to look in on old Calcelmo and drop off an item he'd been sending me letters about. I didn't want the thing, but I kept forgetting about it, and to be fair, I had been avoiding Markarth for various reasons. So the opportunity to deal with that I took. As I was speaking with the old mage, though, I caught the first hint that there was a Daedric lord nearby, faint. Perhaps not the lord themselves, but one of their priests or priestesses. I made my apologies to Calcelmo and wandered about the cavern, following the pull of the lord, and found myself outside the Hall of the Dead, where stood guard a priest of Arkay. I've never had good opinions of them, and I doubt I ever will. But Brother Verilus was quick to prevent my entry. After talking briefly, I knew what was going on, though not why. He reported that the dead had been found partially eaten. With that, and the presence I had felt, there could only be one answer. Lord Namira, Lord of Decay. I told him I would clear it all up if he let me, which had been his plan from the beginning, I think, and then descended into the Hall of the Dead to find Lord Namira's follower. The one I sought did not hide. She came looking for me. I'm not sure what delusion she was working under, but she honestly believed me to be, of all things, a cannibal. Never in my life have I ever considered doing as he suggested I already had, to feast upon the flesh of the fallen. I've heard that the Bosmer practice this as a part of their green pact, but I am no wood elf. Though there was this one time in Windhelm... Oh, but that was a dream, surely. No. Not something that I'd ever considered. But that one conversation did convince her to leave the hall and the dead there alone. Too much attention had already been drawn, besides which, she'd now found what she was looking for, someone of her kind to help clear out the actual location of Lord Namira's shrine. I agreed to meet her there, then left and informed the Arkay priest that all was dealt with. I kept the explanation vague enough that he accepted it without giving actual details. With that done, I left the city for Reachcliff Cave and the Namira cult. The rain and the limited visibility it brought with it made travel to Reachcliff longer than it needed to be. But Aola, the priestess, if you will, was already there and waiting for me when I arrived. The task was simple. All I needed to do was clear out the Draugr that were now investing the cave, the reason that she and the others who followed Namira had been forced to leave the cave. Simplicity. It took a few hours to make my way through the cave, but they all fell, one by one. When I reached the final room where the shrine of Namira was set up, I could not help but be suddenly entranced. I began to doubt my own memory. Had it been a dream, that day back in Windhelm? No, surely not. When I finally came to myself, Aola was waiting to speak with me. She'd been following me the entire time, it seems. Dangerous. But as I'd never noticed her, I had to give her credit for her stealth. With the cave cleared, it was time for a grand feast, and I was to go fetch the main course. None other than Brother Verilis. Perhaps it should have bothered me how quickly I agreed to end the man's life, or rather to lead him to his death. Either way, it was going to be the same result. I could stop this. I could prevent it. But in that moment, I found I would do as I was asked, though I had 2 other things to attend to first in the area. As I had given it little thought at the time, I never bothered to write down a small conversation I had with Professor Marazi at one point during the Windcaller Pass clearing. He had mentioned that he had over the years been trying to find some previous colleagues of his, ones that had all possessed one kind of tool or item or whatever that bordered on being mystical. He even had a map of their last known locations back at the guild house. I had picked that up when last I was there and realized that some of the items I'd already found. Rain's Shelter and Malrus's Codex, for example. If those were similar in power to these others, they were likely worth the time to hunt them. Which brings me to Gloomdusk Cavern in the Reach, a Falmer hive where one such toolset was supposed to be, or at least where its owner was supposed to have been heading when last spoken to. The Falmer was still alive and well, which did not speak well for Arkay and his tool bag. Several hours of creeping and skulking about in the cave system ensued. The Falmer were numerous, and I was surprised that there didn't seem to be any Dwemer ruins associated with this hive, meaning that this group, anyhow, had been expanding their kind into new areas. They aren't overly difficult to deal with under the normal circumstances, but the idea of them becoming so numerous was not a pleasant one. In time, I found a bag that matched the description from the notes and map, though there was no sign of Arkay himself. Unfortunate for him. But that leaves me with the spoils, so to speak. 12 Morning Star, 4th Era, 202. A few hours of sleep later, and I made to deal with Jarl Igmund's request. The Forsworn in question were hiding in a dungeon, a literal one, beneath the ruins of Old Hrelden. A ride across the river and a quick search found what I believed to be the entrance. The interior was half flooded. Unsurprising, I suppose, given how close to the river this was built and how easily water seeps into such underground areas. No, the surprise was in the first 2 things I met, both ghosts of Forsworn. This might make things here a tad more interesting than I had anticipated. I have encountered many ghosts, apparitions, and spectres in my travels. None quite measured up to what I was finding here. Skeletons were everywhere, as one might expect in a dungeon, but these were completely inanimate. The ghosts themselves, however, were different. I don't think they entirely knew that they were dead. Indeed, I begin to wonder if all of them collectively were reinforcing each other's belief in being alive. These ghosts were more solid-seeming, more intelligent than those I have fought before. Silver arrows didn't even affect them the way that they would have a Draugr or a vampire, as they should have. They still died as easily to regular arrow fire as a real living person would have. What happened here? And how recently? Those, fortunately, were not my questions to answer this time. Unless, of course, the leaders I was sent here to deal with were also ghosts, in which case I suppose my mission is already accomplished. They were all ghosts, and there were lots of them. From a few bits and pieces picked up around the ruins, including a number of books I'd not heard of, and picked up for the museum library, of course. This used to be a major Forsworn holdout some years ago, a sacred location too, from the read of these messages and notes, one that the last defenders swore that after they died they would return as wraiths to protect, even in death. That was more than words, it seems, though their success in protecting it now seems even less than it was the first time they died. Once I was sure all of the wraiths were dead, there was little point in sticking around, so I made for Markarth again. Once I talk to Jarl Igmund, I'll have to arrange a dinner with Brother Verilus. Then we can see about fully securing my political presence in Markarth and getting a home here. Having the Jarl's ear even a little bit could be a good thing, after all. I was admitted to Jarl Igmund's presence almost immediately, and I noticed something that I had somehow missed the first time. The entire room is set up for one purpose, to make those appealing to the Jarl feel as small as possible. How else could one feel having to look up so far? My neck hurts just thinking about it. I reported the removal of the Forsworn, which did seem to impress him somewhat. Not enough, however, to even make a home or a thaindom something he was willing to discuss. No, for that, I need to do him a personal favor, as though what I had done wasn't that already. His father was killed during negotiations with the Forsworn some years ago, and his shield, a family heirloom it seems, was thrown to a coven of hagravens. I hate those things, and I still shudder to think that I might, possibly, have been married to one for as long as it took for me to realize it and put an arrow into her neck as a declaration of divorce. Even so, I will be hunting these hagravens down and retrieving Igmund's father's shield. After dinner, of course. I don't want to keep Namira's coven waiting too long. There are many weapons that can bring a man low. Today's weapon of choice for Brother Verilus is greed. It is not uncommon, though I have never made use of such myself, for some adventurers to bring along a priest of Arkay as they delve some dungeon, believing that Arkay's blessing will protect them all. Such was the ruse I made use of, and when he resisted, saying his duties in Markarth took precedence, I had but to mention the possibility of treasure, and he was mine. The thought of easy gold, massive riches, they turn a man's head if presented the right way, and now I will lead Verilus to his death. Perhaps I should feel guilt here. I do not. I have yet to meet a priest of Arkay I haven't despised, really. What matter how they die? In a way, I am doing him a service. He serves the god of death, does he not? Then I have arranged a personal meeting for him. Aola had not been idle while I'd been gone. The main hall had been cleared up, more or less. There was still a lot of bloodstains all over the place, and lit up. She was also no longer alone. I recognized many of those present, most notably the street market meat vendor. I had serious questions about the kind of meat he'd been selling even before this night. Now I had no questions at all and was very grateful to have never brought any of his wares. Verilus, however, was more aware of what was going on than I had believed. His suspicions, however, made no difference. When Aola spoke to him, I've never seen anything like it. She spoke, and he repeated back her words as though in a daze. The mere suggestion of a need for rest before dinner, and he almost happily crossed the room to lay down on the shrine of Namira's flat altar. There he lay, and Aola smiled. The feast was on Namira's table, she told me. I had only to carve. I drew my sword. I raised it to strike. And I hesitated. For just the smallest moment, I thought that perhaps this wasn't the thing I should do. Namira had not sought me out as the other lords had, I had sought her. Perhaps I had made some kind of error. But no. Azure had made it plain I was to use this gift she'd given me, always before it had led to power. Why should this not? This priest was nothing before me, before anyone else there. My resolve firmed. My chin rose. My sword fell. I felt as though I was myself in a dreamlike state. Perhaps this was a dream, just like that day on the Windhelm docks in the middle of the coldest winter I'd ever experienced, stranded on the streets. The blizzard had kept us all indoors, well, those who had doors to be inside. The other beggar I'd been sharing a corner with, I don't even remember his name. He died that night. And in my dream, I won't revisit it further. In this dream, though, I did as I did in the first. I slept not long afterwards. I tell you, it was a dream, a nightmare, and I believe it. It must have been. Even if, the next morning, the Ring of Namira was in my packs. 13 Morningstar, 4th Era, 202. I cleared away from the Namira Coven's home as quickly as I could manage, heading for something that was only marginally better in my mind. A coven of hag ravens. The particular group I was looking for was at Serpent's Bluff, and as early as I rose, almost all of the Forsworn there were asleep when I stole into their camp. They did not survive the early morning hours, and I did not stop to search overly much for equipment or the like. I had only to follow the trail of bodies to know where the shield I was seeking would be found. Into a small underground ruin I went, and from a perch above what was almost a chapel in layout, I shot every last hag-raven in Forsworn I could find. There was no battle, no combat, just slaughter, as I put arrow after arrow into confused and panicked foes. Their screams were almost enjoyable for some reason. I found the shield I was after shortly thereafter, and departed to Markarth. The shield was returned, and the Jarl granted me permission to buy property in Markarth Hold. Wonderful. But because I didn't own the home just yet, Igmund would not name me as Thane. I'd long since made a name for myself in the Hold, as it turned out, which meant that there was just that one little requirement. Something like this I find silly. The steward was right there, next to him. It would take all of about 10 minutes to count out and hand to him all of the gold required for the home, but he stuck to the buy first, feign later line that he'd given me. 10 minutes later, I owned Valindral Hall. 30 seconds after that, I tucked my third thaindom under my belt, along with 2 new weapons to signify my new status. With the home now in my growing list of safe places to sleep that would not cost me anything anymore, a visit to the new home was in order. I crossed the city, climbed a number of staircases, and unlocked the home, after dropping off more things for the museum to sort through. I wasn't told that the human came with a human being, but there Aegis the Bulwark stood. If he's as intelligent as his name suggests, then I suppose the best I can hope for is a very good theft deterrent. Not a bad thing, considering how often I plan to be in residence here, but I had hoped that my housecarl here would be someone with a little more brains than brawn. I suppose this just shows what the locals here consider important. I took a few hours to consider my next region to exert my influence in. Whiterun, Falkreath, and now the Reach were already under my influence, if not my rule, and I feel no further Daedric influences, for the moment, anyhow, in any of them. In thinking on this, I recalled a flyer that had been delivered to me concerning a new museum that was opening in Dawnstar. Call me petty, but I thought to myself, if I could, I would remove such a rival to my own museum. And so Dawnstar became my next destination. 14 Morning Star, 4th Era, 202. Dawnstar. I've had several visits here since I left Windhelm, and many of them have been essentially unmemorable. It was the site of my interaction with Vermina, of course, and when I first came through, it was also beholden to Stormcloak and his rebellion. That, obviously, has changed. The woman I saw the then Jarl yelling at outside of the Jarl's longhouse was raised to take that position, which means that my actions in the Civil War will actually help me with her. In speaking with her, she recognized me immediately and made some land to the south available for me to build a home on, much as Falkreath did, though without the messy killing of bandits requirement first. That was an easy purchase, and I'll need to make arrangements for the home to be built soon. Another safe haven, if I need it. As for becoming Thane, well, there is still some work to do here. I need to mingle, get to know the people here. Unlike Markarth, where I'd figured I'd be well enough known just because of the mess I helped fix, my exploits in Dawnstar are far more under the table. Plus, there is that so-called museum to investigate. It can't be overly large, so likely it isn't a real competitor, but it is always wise to see what is offered up as competition. A stroll around the city, and I had 2 minor tasks to complete for locals, likely more than enough to meet the Jarl's requirements, and something fairly major as well. I hadn't sensed any Daedric lords in the area, but I now have little doubt that there is one in play. Mehrunes Dagon was always a subtle one, until he suddenly wasn't. The museum I have been mentioning is the Museum of the Mythic Dawn, named for the group that almost toppled the Empire at the turn of the 4th Era. They failed, but only by an eyelash. In the years that followed, anything that reeked of the Mythic Dawn or Dagon was destroyed, torn down, and otherwise removed from the general public's knowledge. This includes Dagon's artifact, Mehrunes' razor. Of course, it couldn't be destroyed, but a way was found to break it into pieces. The museum owner, a descendant of one of the cultists, unsurprisingly, has the sheath, but lacks the other pieces. He does, however, know where they are. I, naturally, have volunteered to help gather the pieces for him. Oh, poor fool. If he knew as much about Dagon as I do, he'd know how this is likely to turn out for him. Decidedly not a me problem, however. Before looking into any of those 3 tasks, however, there were some things related to the explorer's tools that I previously mentioned that were nearby. The first of those I had not found was listed as being in the Devaveza, strangely. But my original walkthrough of the vessel hadn't revealed any new books to me, as this one is supposed to be. So, first, a return to the ship and an hour of more painstaking searching, and I found a smuggling compartment in the lower hold, wherein lay the book. The book details a map of a storeroom at Mazulft, a place where a portion of the map had been removed, although not well. I don't recall seeing this room before when I visited it long ago, and so is worth another look, it appears. The second was the fate of Miriam, a lady explorer who went to sea but never returned. Records indicate that the ship might have been lost at sea near the north coast. Using a few other pieces of information I was able to gather in Dawnstar, there was a likely location, one known for being a hazard to ships at sea. I made my way there, prepared a large fire on the shores, and then made my dive. There was a massive ship beneath the waves, and in the main cabin, trapped by collapsed furniture, was a skeleton with Miriam's spyglass still clutched in its hands. Elation aside, The water was freezing, so I quickly departed and made back for the fire I had prepared. During that same dive, I also managed to get involved in something. A document that had something to do with a land lease, though I barely understand a word of it, as water damaged as it was. As I was drying off, though, I noticed a group of Argonians, salvagers from the look of them, not far off. On a whim, I hailed their camp and spoke with their lead. Turned out that document was one of the things they had been searching for. I was directed to a man in Winterhold, Harim. Arriving there to get rid of the thing, I was hired to be a second set of eyes. The man who had hired the Argonians is apparently trying to clear his father's name of something, though I have yet to get all of the details. I am to meet him at Winterfrost Cottage, in Hafinga Hold, north of Dragonsbridge. I have some time before that will be something to deal with, perhaps when I next return to the museum, though I have plenty of traveling ahead of me just to find the Razor's pieces. I hadn't planned on being in Winterhold this morning, but since I was already here, there was another of the explorer's tools that was supposedly in the area, something called Sand's Torch. Sand was supposed to have been exploring Stillborn Cave, a place I have passed many times coming in and out of Winterhold itself, so I already knew the location. Though it was already somewhat late to start a cave exploration, I decided to begin anyhow. Worst case, I would end up working through the night, take a quick nap tomorrow, and then continue on as I had intended. After all, it wasn't like I hadn't done similar before. I could not bear the thought of being idle in the middle of the coldest region of Skyrim. It wasn't long before I found the missing explorer and the reason for their death. This cave is a small Falmer hive, so it was no surprise when I found the corpse riddled with Falmer arrows. The torch was still in its hand, as well, which at least made the retrieval easy. That all said, this is now the second hive I have been in recently that seems to have no association with a Dwemer ruin. Are the Falmer making active attempts to return to the surface, perhaps? Maybe that old snow elf I met back when is actually making inroads with them despite the chances. On the other hand, if that were the case, then they'd likely be a tad bit less hostile as well, so perhaps there's something else going on. Regardless, I find it somewhat concerning, as should the rest of Skyrim, I think. They are not a threat yet, but if this kind of activity continues, it is only a matter of time before they are. I found myself heading further and further from Dawnstar as my immediate objectives pulled me onwards. Mazulft was not far off, though it was in Eastmarch. That lay nearby the Rift, of course, where the Akund expedition was likely awaiting my arrival. All of the steps made sense at the time, and so it was that, somehow, I found myself on the bridge leading to Windhelm. It was a strange experience standing there, knowing that once it had been my home, knowing that the tyrant I had sworn vengeance against was months dead and gone, knowing that despite everything I had done for and in that city, I would still be looked down on, spat on, because of an accident of birth, because I was Dunmer. I smile to think that eventually, if my plan works out, I will be Thane here. And how much that will irritate these racist, bigoted bastards. That gave me the strength I needed to take shelter from the storm and stay the night at Candlehearth Hall.